Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Sir David Lidington decenijama je poznato lice političke scene Velike Britanije. Obavljao je funkciju državnog parlamentarca, ministra za evropska pitanja i kasnije zamjenika premijerke Therese May. Danas je predsjednik Kraljevskog instituta za sigurnosna i politička pitanja, poznato kao RUSI. O ratu u Ukrajini, reakcijama NATO saveza, interesima Velike Britanije i situaciji na Balkanu za Al Jazeera govori Sir David Lidington.
Sir David Lidington, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, why has the UK been spearheading efforts in arming Ukraine far ahead of its many European allies? And would you argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has given the UK a new momentum and a burgeoning new profile on the international stage?
I think the UK's position under the Johnson government is a natural development of the approach that the United Kingdom has taken to Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, and then with Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. I can remember sitting back in 2013, 14, 15 at the Foreign Affairs Council table in Brussels, and we were always amongst the more hardline of EU member states in arguing for a strong sanctions policy against Russia then. So I think that the Johnson government's willingness to supply lethal weaponry to Ukraine derives from that history, also from the fact that we in Britain experienced the Russian chemical agent attack on our own soil in the attack in Salisbury a few years ago, which led to the death of one British citizen. And I think also we do see the Russian aggression against Ukraine as a very significant breach of fundamental principles about respect for international borders, respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, which, if not resisted and checked, will set a very dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. So I think that is what explains the UK government position. Has it meant that the UK can assert itself more vigorously as a big player in European security policy? Yes, I do. I think this is the first major crisis affecting the security of Europe since the UK left the European Union. That means inevitably we're going to have a different sort of relationship between ourselves and the EU member states. But I think what we've shown is that we are spearheading a group of allies within NATO and in the Joint Expeditionary Force membership of mostly northern and Central European countries, but also that we have worked very closely with the EU institutions in framing a sanctions package that we hope will do significant damage to Putin's war effort in the medium term.
Mm-hmm. Now, Britons of all stripes are lionizing Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, as a hero, while at the same time blasting their own somewhat disheveled leader. Why is Johnson's government coming under withering fire for what critics say is a slow and inadequate response to the war?
I think the Johnson government's not coming under pressure for an inadequate response to the war, certainly not from within Britain. I think if you look at the British opinion polls, they're largely in favour of the action the government's taken, and the Johnson government on this has support from all the main opposition parties in the United Kingdom as well. Where the British government has been under pressure, where there is public dissatisfaction, is over the issue of Ukrainian refugees.
Refugees, right.
Where our response is seen, and I share this view, as having been less generous than that of other big European players, and where there has been far too much bureaucracy, too much form-filling, delay associated with getting people in desperate need to shelter in the UK, where there are more than 100,000 UK families have signed up to host Ukrainian refugees. And I know personally people who are feeling aggrieved because it's taking them forever to get visas approved by the relevant UK authorities and think this really should be done much more speedily.
Right, but has the UK government been dragging its feet when it comes to sanctioning Russian tycoons who have stashed millions, if not billions of dollars in London?
No, I think you can make a reasonable criticism that we did not act sooner in previous years, in response to the aggression in 2008 and 2014. But I think the action that's been taken now is very significant. It's not. I don't actually think that sanctioning individuals and their assets is the most important and powerful sanctions method. I mean, it gets good headlines. Someone like Roman Abramovich gets sanctioned. But the real power is in the exclusion of Russia from the main arteries of the international economy. It's the exclusion from SWIFT, where we have been pushing for the exclusions, which are partial at the moment, to go further. The freezing of the ability of the Russian central bank to deploy reserves and gold that they hold under the jurisdiction of Western and other democratic allies. And those are really important areas of sanctions where the UK government has been one of the leaders in the international debate. Mm-hmm.
Now, the war in Ukraine is not just testing the UK's position on the global stage. Countries around the world are realigning themselves to a new political reality. Finland and Sweden are edging closer to joining NATO, and the potential Russian response to such a move is yet unknown. Are we witnessing a real tipping point for security and defense policy across Europe and across the Atlantic?
I think we're certainly seeing two things. We're seeing a reassertion of the vital importance of the transatlantic alliance. The United States has been very focused, I think, on the Indo-Pacific for the last several years, so certainly since the Obama administration. And I think that Washington has accepted that they can't simply regard Europe as a done deal, that everything's now peaceful there, they could ignore it, that actually this really does matter, and Russian aggression is the matter of great concern to the interests of the United States. I hope that rediscovered transatlantic unity would survive a Republican victory in 2024. And obviously when Mr. Trump was in office in the White House, he was a noted skeptic about NATO. And so there are considerable worries in European capitals, including London, about what a new Trump presidency would mean. I think that we are seeing European countries reassessing their position urgently. If you'd said to me even a year ago that we would now be talking about Finland and Sweden joining NATO during 2022, I'd have laughed. I would have said that's never going to happen. The history of neutrality is too deep-rooted there. And I think it's a measure of how badly President Putin has miscalculated that government parties and opposition parties in Sweden and Finland are now talking seriously about a NATO application. That even in Ireland, with its history of neutrality since the Irish state was founded, is now starting a conversation about what that actually means, and should Ireland be more involved in defence and security matters for Europe as a whole, and above all, Germany. Now, I would like to see Germany move further and faster than she is doing at the moment, but one has to acknowledge that what Chancellor Scholz announced in supplying lethal weaponry direct to a friendly but non-NATO competent country, Ukraine, and in committing himself to meet the NATO spending target of 2% of GDP on defence, he was ditching German reservations in his own Social Democrat Party and more widely that go back over generations. And that was a really historic shift of the German position. And I hope very much that is followed through further by German leaders.
The first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, once said that the Western alliance was created to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Is this still the case today? I mean, can Europe be secure without the U.S.?
Oh, I think it's a really important strategic question for European powers to consider. I think we have to do more and better to persuade political leaders and voters in the United States that the security of Europe should still be seen as a vital national interest of the United States. And I would criticize President Trump's skepticism towards NATO, but one has to accept that Donald Trump represented a significant slice of American opinion that thought that Europe had for far too long been spending too little on defense and exercising inadequate political leadership, freeloading on the US taxpayer. So we have to persuade the US that European security really matters to Americans and American interests. And that includes showing we're doing our bit. That means, yes, European countries have to spend 2% and I think more in future on defense and security, more than we've done in the past. And it means that European countries have to accept greater responsibility for leadership in parts of the world which the United States will not always see as a primary American interest. I think that Europe will need to show support, great support for the democratizing movement and for rule of law in the Balkans. I think that we need to raise our game in Eastern Europe to try to help Moldova, and assuming that Ukraine survives this current attack from Putin, we're going to have to support the Ukrainian economy in a very big way as it seeks to rebuild. And that's work that's going to take many, many years into the future. And I don't think they'll be able to afford that cost on their own. There'll be parts of Africa where I think that European countries will need to take a lead to provide humanitarian assistance, but also to try to combat terrorism and organized crime, and to help African leaders and African countries build stronger rule of law institutions and better governance in their own nations.
Right. You mentioned the Balkans. Do you think Russia's President Vladimir Putin will stop in Ukraine, or do you think that he might try his hand at Moldova, or even perhaps in the Western Balkans, more precisely in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where he can use the existing cracks and divisions within society to pursue his own agenda, perhaps by supporting Kremlin-friendly proxies, including Bosnia's president, Milorad Dodik, who is a Serb president within Bosnia's tripartite presidency?
I don't think it's a matter of whether Putin will go beyond Ukraine into the Balkans, and he's already meddling in the Balkans. I mean, there have been Russian troops in Transnistria, the legally part of Moldovan territory, for many, many years. When I was Britain's Minister for Europe, we saw Russian meddling in Bosnia-Herzegovina, particularly in Republika Srpska. We saw the Russians attempting to pull Serbia under President Vučić and his predecessors more into the Russian orbit and away from friendly relations with democratic Europe. We have seen Russian interference in elections in Montenegro and in North Macedonia. So there's a long history of Russian subversion and Russian influence peddling in the Balkans. And we certainly in democratic Europe need to be on our guard against that. And we need to resist it. And we need to support the people and leaders in the Balkans who are trying to strengthen democratic institutions and the rule of law and human rights in their countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Western allies seem to be obsessed with avoiding escalation and direct conflict with Russia. Hence, their decision not to impose a no-fly zone above Ukraine. Does this merely confirm to Putin that he has the entire domain of conventional warfare and the whole Eurasian landmass, except for countries that are within NATO, in which he can do as he pleases? I mean, could Central Asia, or say Kazakhstan, which is home to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, be a next target for Putin should a pro-friendly government, a pro-Western government come to power?
Well, I don't know what plans he might have for Kazakhstan or for other Central Asian countries, but he certainly has in the past talked about Moscow having the right to intervene anywhere in the world in support of Russian speakers whom he assumes to be Russians with a loyalty to Russia rather than to the country of which they are citizens. But I think that it's wrong to say, as I think your question did risk implying, that the choice was between all-out war with Russia and doing nothing. I think if you look at the diplomatic, political, and economic measures that have been taken against Russia, they're doing very severe damage to the Russian economy already, and that damage will get worse as time goes on. But I do think that it is wise for President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, President Macron in particular, to weigh the risks of escalation to chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons in the current conflict. You know, there is a key burden of responsibility that lies particularly on the shoulders of the United States president to avoid thermonuclear war, which would leave certainly the whole of the European continent, including Russia, but probably North America as well, absolutely devastated, and the harm from which would envelop the rest of the planet as well, because of the weather and climatic changes that a nuclear holocaust would cause. So I think that is a sensible calibration of risk. And I notice that President Biden has been sending a twin message to Russia. He's been saying both, we are not going to go and fight Russian troops, you know, as the United States in Ukraine, but he's also said, we, the United States, we will defend every square inch of NATO territory, every member state of NATO. And I think it's a very clear warning to the Kremlin not to think that they could play games in, for example, Lithuania or Estonia, or in the Suwalki corridor of territory in eastern Poland, and think that that would somehow avoid a direct clash with NATO forces.
Right, so you don't think that the invasion of Ukraine could plausibly precipitate into a wider European conflict?
Oh, I think the risk is there. I mean, I hope it doesn't. I think that there are two things I'd say. First of all, Putin's record is that he believes in strength, and that he will keep on testing. If he thinks that he's had a weak response from his adversaries, he will push a bit further. And I think that is why it is so important that Western European solidarity and US solidarity with Ukraine is not just spoken about, but demonstrated through the supply of weaponry and the strongest possible political and economic support as well. But also, in any conflict like this, there is the risk of a misjudgment, of a miscalculation, you know, a missile that goes slightly off track and let us say hits a NATO country,
for example.
or a pilot of an aircraft, you know, makes a misjudgment or a miscalculation, and you suddenly end up with a direct clash, even if the high commands did not intend that. So that risk is always there, and we have to be prepared for that.
Do you see defense spending throughout Europe soaring over the next couple of years? Do you think that we might go back to Cold War levels?
Yes, I do. I mean, exactly how much defense spending will need to rise will be a judgment for the governments of each country to make. But I think, I would say that look at this objectively. What Putin's aggression has shown is that we cannot be complacent, that there is a risk of further aggression from Russia, both in terms of conventional warfare, but also, you know, as I said, in the UK, we've had experience of a chemical weapons attack already, and of a radiological agent being used to kill Mr. Litvinenko a few years previously. But also cyber. You know, we've got to be on our guard against aggression from a number of different quarters, sort of inspired and led by Russia. I think, yeah, there's going to have to be more. We are in effect going to be sadly in a new Cold War with Russia, and I cannot see anything like sort of business as usual being resumed while Vladimir Putin is in power in the Kremlin.
Right, so Russia is clearly rejoining the divisions and spheres of influence across Europe. So what's next? You're talking about the new Cold War, increased spending on defense.
Yes, I don't think it's a matter of spheres of influence. I mean, I reject that Russian view of the world. It should be a matter for sovereign European countries to decide on their own alliances and their own futures. And I think what Putin has found so difficult to come to terms with is that it is precisely fear of Russian aggression and the experience of Russian colonial rule in the period since the Second World War that has made countries like the Baltic republics want to anchor themselves in NATO and the EU, and has made countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia very keen to move in the same direction as well. You know, it's not so long ago that I can remember, you know, talking to Ukrainian ministers, you know, who were saying we need to remain good friends with Russia, but we also want good relations with the West. And I think what Putin will have accomplished by this latest act of aggression is to strengthen in a very powerful way the sense of Ukrainian nationhood, of Ukrainian national solidarity, and he will have increased hatred of Russia. I think you have to use a word like that, hatred of Russia, including amongst Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Look at what is happening in cities like Kherson, overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, occupied by Russian aggressive forces, with Russian-speaking Ukrainians coming out on the streets, waving the blue and yellow flag of Estonia, telling the Russian soldiers to go home. That's a measure of how Putin has failed to win the hearts and minds of Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers in Ukraine alike.
Right. Sir David, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to speak to you.